What's going on here? I'm lost. Hello, my name is Will, and this is Exploding Helicopter, a podcast that's actually hosted by my secret identical twin brother. Here's a challenge. Name a Michael Winner film not called Death Wish. Tricky, isn't it? And that's the point. For a man so famous for being a film director, he really didn't make very many famous films. These days, if anyone remembers him at all, it's as a notoriously waspish restaurant critic or a smug-faced presence in car insurance commercials. But never let it be said that this podcast is afraid of terrible movie making. Throwing any notion of quality control to the wind, Exploding Helicopter has dived into one of the dustier corners of the Winner cinematic canon, mostly so you don't have to. So on this show, we're taking a look at the bonkers, the twisty, the unforgettable, but not in a good way, firepower. To help me review the film, I'm joined by my regular sparring partner on this podcast, Nick Rehak. Welcome back to the show, buddy.
Well, thank you so much for having me back.
Well, I always enjoy having you on, and you very rarely complain about the films I ask you to watch, which increasingly is becoming an important attribute for your continuing participation.
It's always a challenge, but it's always something fun and exciting to be like, hey, you want to watch this? And immediately I'm like, yeah. And then watching it, I'm like, why do I do this to myself?
Exactly. It's that kind of goldfish memory that I rely on in order to kind of get you back time after time.
Yeah, basically.
Now, I am interested in your perspective on Michael Winner, because here's a guy who made quite a lot of films over the course of 30 years, and he worked with some big stars during that time. But in more recent times, he has mostly been known for things other than filmmaking. He was a British director, and certainly here he managed to maintain a kind of high public profile even when his film career had largely passed by. But I'm interested. You're an American. What is your awareness of his films and the man in general?
Zero. Until you mentioned the name, I'm like, I don't know who this guy is. But then when you said Death Wish, I'm like, oh, I'm familiar with those. But then I'll hit you with some double ignorance. I have never seen any of the Death Wish films. To add on top of that, the only Charles Bronson films I've seen are The Great Escape, where he plays a tunnel guy, and Four for Texas, a Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra film from the early 60s. I am an ignoramus on this episode.
Wow, I mean, wow, that's quite a sort of double-barreled blast from your sort of cinematic shotgun that you've fired there. Because Charles Bronson, I mean, he was a huge star in the 1970s. I mean, if you look at like the most bankable box office stars during that particular decade, I'm pretty sure it was like Charles Bronson, Clint Eastwood were like 1 and 2, and for some of those years, Charles Bronson would have been number 1. So I mean, I feel you're a man who likes to feel like your way around the sort of cinematic canon. I feel like you're sort of missing out on somebody who's actually a big star and made some films that I don't necessarily know if they're important, but films that people watched, if nothing else.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Death Wish is in the cultural lexicon to an extent. You have stuff like The Mechanic and other films that he's done that have kind of been remade, or at least the concept has been kind of touched on and off. But, and I hate to do this, I blame my grandmother. She only had James Bond DVDs, Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, Steven Seagal, and Chuck Norris. Now, had she had some Charles Bronson in there, I'd probably be a little more fluent, if you will, with his work. But as for now, nothing.
We're talking about Charles Bronson here, but obviously he's a figure as an actor who is synonymous, I guess, with Michael Winner, because they made many films together during the 1970s and into the 1980s. And you're professing a bit of an ignorance of Michael Winner. I mean, I think he is somebody who essentially kind of carved out a career in genre filmmaking, who kind of latched onto big stars like Charles Bronson and essentially sort of worked with those kind of like big stars consistently. And I think his sort of modus operandi, it seems, was to basically be a very easy person to work with. Bizarrely, do you know who Marlon Brando cites as his favourite director to work with?
If you tell me it's Michael Winner, I'm going to be very shocked.
Well, it is Michael Winner.
I find that hard to believe.
In Marlon Brando's autobiography, he cites Michael Winner as the kind of like his the best director that he ever worked with, and the kind of the sort of the account that he gives is essentially that sort of Michael Winner said, "Look, you are a very great actor. I am a very average director. You can do whatever you like, and it's okay with me." And we all know what Marlon Brando was like on a film set. Being given carte blanche to do whatever the hell he liked by a director was manna from heaven for him. So that essentially is how sort of Michael Winner sort of managed to continue making movies for such a long period of time. And it's probably part of the reason why many of his films are not terribly good, which may be a theme that we pick up on when we start talking about firepower.
I feel like when he goes to direct a scene, he's like, all right, everybody ready? Have fun with it, and whenever. Like, not even action, just at your own pace.
I think there could be more than a grain of truth to that, but I think it's time we got stuck into firepower. But before we do that, let's learn a little more about the richest man in the world.
The richest and most powerful man in the world. No one knows what he looks like, where he is, or why he's killing people. The only clues to his identity are a few personal habits, like his drugs, his fondness for sadistic games, and his appetite for magnificent women. It would take a miracle to capture him. We're back. A miracle called Jerry Fennon.
Jerry Fennon? He's retired now. Gardening or something.
Unretire him.
Only Hyman can do that.
So, ask Hyman.
I don't want to abuse this thing we have. It's a contract. The fee, $1 million. Inflation.
Anyone ever tell you what's wrong, Miss Steve? I'm just redistributing the wealth, man. What brought you back?
Got a gig. Behind me? Yeah. Could use some help. Money's thing.
Hey, I don't kill people.
It's a grab. Firepower. Here, let me help you with that.
When I take my earrings off, I go to bed.
I think she's quite a threat.
I think she's quite magnificent.
The power of desire. The power of courage. The power of force. Crime. Evil. Protection. Law. Firepower. The U.S. government doesn't know where he is.
We were closing in, but he left the States.
The mafia wants him.
I'm beginning to think Stegner may not be on the island.
And no one has what it takes to find him.
I'll get Stegner for you.
Firepower.
I hope you're sitting comfortably, because the plot for this is going to take quite a bit of explanation. This insanely confusing story begins when a scientist is killed by an explosion in his laboratory. His widow, played by Sophia Loren, is convinced that the untimely death is the work of a crooked industrialist called Stegman. Sultry Sophia turns to the FBI for help, but they're unable to act since Stegman is living on a Caribbean island with no extradition laws. Faced with such an administrative challenge, the feds do what any reasonable law enforcement organisation might do. They employ a shady mafia boss to kidnap Mr. Big and spirit him back to the US on their behalf. So far so sensible, right? But we're only getting started. Next, the mafia don calls up a retired hitman, played by James Coburn, to carry out the kidnapping. The contract killer's first step is to recruit his identical secret twin brother, also played by James Coburn. Now at this point, you're barely 10 minutes into the film, and the layers of bunkum and confusion just continue to multiply and sprawl from here. So for the sake of everybody's sanity, we're going to leave plot matters there. Suffice to say that over the next nearly 2 hours, there's an unrelenting barrage of double crosses, secret identities, and hidden agendas. Instead, let's talk about the cast. Befitting a film that's so all over the place, the players are an eclectic jumble of famous actors, familiar faces, and what the hell are they doing in this cameos. Topping the bill is lanky-limbed leading man James Coburn and Euro cinema royalty Sophia Loren. Alongside them, there's a rogue gallery of bit part actors, including Eli Wallach, Vincent Gardenia, O.J. Simpson, and Dominic Junior Soprano Chianese. And if that isn't dizzying enough, there are blink and you'll miss it cameos from the legendary boxer Jake LaMotta and 50s Hollywood beefcake Victor Mature. Now, interestingly, this film started life as a Dirty Harry sequel before being retooled as a project for Charles Bronson. But with pre-production underway, Bronson pulled out of the film, leading to Coburn's last-minute casting in the main role. Firepower has a user rating of exactly 5 on IMDb and a user rating of 2.7 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So, with all of that out of the way, Nick, what did you make of Firepower?
It makes a lot more sense after hearing you explain it. And I wish I was saying that as like a joke and to get a laugh, but this film is truly confusing. As I watched it, I'm trying to keep in my head like what exactly is happening and what's going on. But at times it felt like we were just going from set piece to set piece. We never really know what country we're in at times. We don't really know what most of these people are talking about. And there's a lot of issues for me sound-wise. I know that sounds weird and that usually doesn't detract, but I don't know who did the sound editing in this film or just sound recording in general, but it feels like every line by anybody is like ADR and kind of re-recorded differently. And also, whenever somebody walks at any moment in any scene in the film, it is one of the loudest things I've ever heard in my life. So, and when you're distracted by the walking, all of a sudden it's blink and you miss it and something happens. Or especially when we get to O.J. Simpson's character, he's a bit of a I don't want to say a spy, but he has very spy-esque qualities in that he can kind of change his appearance very quickly and kind of blend in with his surroundings. So if you're paying attention, you're like, okay, I see what's happening. It's like, now why is he a firefighter all of a sudden? Like, what happened? What now he's a landscaper. What happened here? Why did we do this? It's just a very confusing film. And I think if they would have taken two of those elements out of there, especially like the twin stuff, which gets bizarre, it could have been a little bit stronger. But overall, it feels like a weird TV movie. It also feels like we're missing a lot of film. The movie starts, and it's just they're on the street driving. They pull into a parking spot, and the husband looks over and he goes, fine, and then gets out of the car. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It just happens, and you're left confused. And then it is kind of cool, though, when the film actually kicks off, because it kind of adds that like energy into it and stuff. But it's just it catches you off guard at the beginning, and then you just stay off guard the rest of the film. Even the exploding helicopter that we'll get to later. I'm still very confused about that.
Well, hey Nick, I've got a lot of sympathy for your views about this particular film. I mean, this is a phenomenally complex film. I mean, the kind of plot summary I gave, there is loads of stuff I've left out of that because, you know, I would just be talking about this film for the rest of this podcast if I tried to cover it all. I mean, the plot is, you know, is more tangled than a bowl of congealed spaghetti. I completely agree with what you were saying. I mean, you know, a little bit earlier before we got started this review, is like this film kind of feels like it's been made up on the fly. There's definitely this quality of like, the actors have never been in, you know, the actors and director have never been in this location before. They kind of arrived 30 minutes before and they've just kind of like worked out, yeah, you stand over here and, oh, all right, there's this kind of funky bridge here. We'll kind of incorporate that into the scene. There's this quality of it just all sort of being made up on the hoof here. And I mean, this, you know, I think I've regularly railed against the length of films, but this film, it's an hour and 44 minutes, and there is
Yeah.
nothing about this film that justifies the runtime of this particular film. But in the end, you're just left with this absolutely sort of baffling thriller that just goes on far too long, and just totally outstays its welcome.
Absolutely. And I feel like in the beginning, it's kind of tight. You have a couple elements of like espionage, right? When Coburn and Simpson, when their characters, that actually sounds like a really cool TV show. When James Coburn and O.J. Simpson's character sneak into the house. There's stuff like that. There's stuff when Sophia Loren's character, Adele, she's walking through the streets of wherever she is, and she's being followed, and the way she kind of breaks away from him and then is able to escape. I'm like, okay, we got a little bit of a thriller, a little bit of espionage there. That's pretty cool how she does that. But then we get really intense out of nowhere where they're kidnapping some guy, tying him up, dunking him in water, and like covering him with blood in order to get like sharks to get him as part of some interrogation thing. Like, we make some serious jumps. And then it at times feels like a David Lynch film, because all of a sudden, and I still can't believe this happened, there's a character that we hear them talking, and OJ's like, hey, how come his mouth didn't move? And out comes a little person that's been kind of this little puppet master all along. And I'm just so confused by his placement, and how he interacts and how he touches people is really bizarre. And some of the language and verbiage they use, how they refer to, twice in the film they said a darkie. I think at one point they said blackie. Then there's a casino scene where O.J. Simpson's character walks up next to Coburn's, and he says along the lines of, you look like a waiter at an Alabama fried chicken restaurant. And I don't know why he couldn't have just said, hey, you clean up really nice.
They also dropped the N-bomb in this film as well, which I mean, it was the late 70s. It was a different era. Yeah, the amount of casual racism in this film is certainly is uncomfortable viewing for.
Yeah, it's just weird. Like,
in
I
these
get
days.
It's of the time, but it doesn't feel natural. You know
No.
what I mean? Like,
It's really
unnatural.
unnecessary, and also it's also really unnecessary.
Yeah,
It's also really
absolutely.
unnecessary, and
Yeah.
I think also, I mean, I agree with what you say. Like, there are definitely parts of this film that feel really tight, and I actually think the first 4 or 5 minutes of this film actually are really tight and make you think that you're actually in for like a really good watch, because within the first few minutes of the film you see Sophia Loren's husband be blown up in his laboratory. Then there's a kind of an assassination that takes place on the street. Then Sophia Loren is in with the FBI, and she's saying, look, I need you to investigate this guy Stegman, because he's behind my husband's assassination, because he had all the dirt on Stegman, and it basically it goes through a lot of background material, like in a whole load of rat-a-tat-tat scenes in that kind of first 4 or 5 minutes, and you think, wow, this is a thriller that's really moving at a pace. But I think, well, then all manner of things sort of happen. Then you get all manner of like baggy dialogue scenes, and then just the continuing number of twists and turns that happen in the plot. I don't know how you felt, but by the end of this movie, I literally had no idea what was going on. Like, who was double crossing who, what anyone's real identity was. I was hopelessly confused.
Absolutely, because then it becomes halfway through the movie, what are we really doing here? That's the game that you have to play with yourself. What are we really doing here? What are we trying to accomplish in this movie? And even at the end, when she's at this gala, and then some random guy just walks up and they're like, oh yeah, he's like the 4th richest man in the world, or some bizarre way to like word his value. And she's like, oh hey. And then it's just credits. Like, it's a weird TV show, and the episode's ended, and we're supposed to like all giggle like, oh that Adele, being a gold digger out there, or whatever she's doing. But like you said, all the double crosses, I don't know who to root for. I don't know if I should be rooting for anybody. Are there heroes? Are there anti-heroes? Like, what is? But like you said, it starts off really tight. They're leaving the funeral home. And all of a sudden, her brother runs over, shoots this mob guy. Everyone's freaking out, and then bam, credits and music. I'm like, this is going to be great. The shot just holds on the police showing up, the ambulance showing up, just all the chaos. And then it cuts to her going into her house, and everything is disheveled, and a guy's like, yeah, you're going to want some protection. And when I saw all that, I'm thinking back to when you reached out to me. I'm like, maybe Will's got this wrong. Maybe it's actually like a really good, and he was just like in a weird mood when he watched it. But it's like as soon as they meet Eli Wallach, it just falls apart. And I'm like, okay, this is what he meant. And then as the film continued, I'm like, he was right. I should have said no.
Because what the sort of the I don't understand why this film had to be quite so complicated, but quite why they had to have all this insane number of twists and turns in this film is completely baffling. I mean, we are very quickly in the film, we're introduced to James Coburn's identical twin brother. It's actually quite a cool concept, but the film just throws it away. They don't actually do anything interesting with it. There's just like one scene in the film later on where James Coburn uses his kind of identical twin brother to like fake out the villains that he's actually returned to the States from this Caribbean island. But that, you know, that's not a particularly exciting moment. It's not particularly pivotal in the plot line of the film. So like, why bother having this identical twin brother in the film at all?
Well, I think it leads to a bigger point is why are you focusing on certain things and elements over others? In the beginning, we have this, or towards the beginning, we have that really big set piece, right, where Sophia Loren's character is walking through that market. We have them sneaking in and burning someone's house down. We have them tying up a man, dumping blood over him in the ocean to attract the sharks. There's a scene at the end of the casino where she's taking off her earrings, and she says to him, she's like, I only take my earrings off when I go to bed. And then we're like, okay, so something's going to happen. It fades to black, kind of that wink and nod, like, yeah, they're about to have sex. And then it immediately cuts to a cockfight. And we're watching chickens tear each other apart. And I'm like, we don't need to show this. You can't run into them in any other way. It picks up a little bit with a really better than it should be gunfight between some guys in a helicopter. But after that, it just kind of gets slow, and then it picks back up. And by the time it picks back up, it's like, why bother? Like, there's no sense in any of this. When is it just going to end? And then when it does end, you're like, it ended like that? Like, of all the endings to have, like, do a big cliffhanger. Do something that, like, really grabs you and holds on to you. Don't just, like, I don't know. It just seemed like such a weird, like, postscript ending. I didn't care for it.
But what I mean, I'm going into the weeds here a bit with this film. But one thing I really, especially as I've watched this film a couple of times now, one thing I couldn't get over with this film is the fact that Sophia Loren, her husband is murdered. She goes to the FBI, and the FBI say they can't help. And Sophia Loren kind of has anticipated the fact that the FBI will say, you know what, we can't help because Stegman's in this, you know, Caribbean island with no extradition treaty. And she says, what about you get out this guy Jerry Fannin, this kind of, you know, notorious hitman? Why don't you get him to kind of help? And the FBI say, okay, we can't be seen to do that, but we can get this mafia boss to sort of, you know, act as a intermediary so that there's a bit of deniability for us. And we get this mafia boss to hire Fannin to kidnap Stegman, bring him back to the USA. But what we learned later in the film is that Sophia Loren had like a relationship with Fannin sort of like 15 years previously. So if she wants Stegman kind of kidnapped and brought back to the USA, she doesn't need to go to the FBI to get the FBI to get the mafia boss to then hire Jerry Fannin to then kidnap Stegman. She could just go directly to James Coburn's character and get him to you know, and hire him to kidnap the Stegman character and bring him back to the States. There's no need for these like steps 2 and 3. She could just proceed straight to the end point here.
And I think they kind of want to make it bigger than what it is. I mean, it's already pretty big. Someone's being blown up. You know, there's mob bosses involved, you know, all this other stuff. But I guess they wanted to add to that extra conspiratorial, like the FBI and having to go to a mob boss, like how this is really serious and it's crazy. But like you said, it kind of just falls apart and falls flat. It's like, yeah, why did we have to do that? You know, there's a lot of why did we have to do that in this movie.
Yeah. I mean, Nick, is this the most confusing film you've ever seen? You know, where does it rank in kind of like baffling movies that you've seen?
It's at the top of some of the most confusing films I've seen, but not for good reason. Like, truly confusing. It's not like there's some movies where, like some might say Looper is confusing, right? Because you have any kind of film that plays with time travel, you might consider that confusing. Or it's like really high concept science. I mean, I can understand that, but this is just a whole different level of you could edit this to where it would make sense, but you'd have to cut a lot out. You would drop it to easily 50 minutes, under an hour for sure.
I think it might even be 15 minutes if you wanted to really make it make sense. But let's talk about the cast here, because yes, this is a disappointing film, but there are a lot of famous actors, big names here in this film. You know, did any of them emerge with any credit? I mean, who stuck out for you, for good reasons or bad?
Nobody. Nobody. Everybody just kind of felt plain. Like Sophia Loren just felt like she was there. Eli Wallach almost looked like he was happy to be on the screen. You had Jake LaMotta, right, famous boxer, and it's kind of like, why is he here? And then pretty much O.J. Simpson carries every single scene he's in, because he just, to me, feels like a more dynamic actor, which you wouldn't expect to say, given that James Coburn, Sophia Loren, and Eli Wallach are on the screen. Like, they're really they're just good actors. I'm not saying O.J. Simpson's not, but you just, like this old school Hollywood, you expect them to have this presence, and they just don't. Instead, O.J.'s just stealing the scenes. But I also wonder if that's like my own, I don't want to say bias coming in, but I'm used to seeing O.J. from like the Naked Gun films, and he was always right there and funny and in your face and on the screen. So my eyes like naturally went to him.
What did you think of the action scenes in this particular film? I mean, I'm going to put my cards on the table straight out the gate here. I'm going to say quite a few of them struck me as totally inept.
Oh, absolutely. The big fight where they're fighting the I guess no other way to word this. They're fighting the helicopter where they're shooting at each other back and forth. This helicopter's flying around, and the guy is with a machine gun firing shots, and they are missing more than a stormtrooper would. It absolutely blows my mind. Nobody's getting nicked. The water's getting shot up. The dirt's getting shot up. And it's actually a really good like fake out, because at some points I'm watching this like, here we go, it's getting ready to blow, and then it doesn't. And I'm like, okay, all right, we're saving it for later on in the film. I see you. I see what's going on. But and some of like the chases, there's one chase scene where they go to start it off. She gets in the car.
I know exactly what you're talking about. They go. It lasts about 12 feet. That chase scene.
She's got no idea like how to start the car and get it moving. And then when she does, as almost to get their attention, Coburn just shoots a bunch of bullets at the sky to get there, and then like they drive off. It's like, what are you trying to do?
And there's a kind of big assassination sequence that takes place at an airport that involves the target being in a car that is sort of dumped over with a kind of a lorry load of oranges, which just seems like, I mean, I'm not an international assassin, but there is no way I would have planned out that as a way of bumping somebody off and being confident that I was going to be able to fulfill my contract.
I think that's that making it up as you go. I think on the day they had something planned and someone just went, hey guys, I got a great idea. And then that's what they filmed.
I think we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at the exploding helicopter action.
You gotta have your finger on the trigger.
Into a future where women, weapons, and fuel all have their price. A vast landscape ruled with an iron hand by one master. Warlords. Now, a soldier on a mission comes face to face.
Long time no
will see.
with the master of the mutant army.
We could have negotiated for a little easier death.
But how can one man possibly hope to challenge the awesome might of the ruthless warlord?
Is that your best shot?
Warlords. When they go to war, one will win, and one will die. David Carradine, Sid Haig, and Don Wildsmith star in Warlords, the epic adventure of the future.
We're back, and now we're looking at the exploding helicopter action. After kidnapping the Mr. Big industrialist, Coburn makes his getaway, pursued by the villain's henchmen. Luckily, old Longshanks has anticipated the baddies' pursuit plans and cannily placed a series of time-delayed bombs in their vehicles. One of them, as you can doubtless surmise, is in a helicopter. A hectic chase ensues, and after a few minutes, one of the bombs reliably detonates and puts paid to a pursuing car. But that still leaves a helicopter buzzing ominously overhead and a small posse of horse-riding heavies on Coburn's trail. The villains close in, and it looks like it's about to get sticky for Big Jim. Fortunately, with contrived good fortune, the chopper chooses that very moment to blow up, and if that wasn't lucky enough, the falling debris knocks out the henchman on horseback. Nick, what did you make of the exploding helicopter action?
Now that you've explained it, it makes a lot more sense. I must have missed the part where they set a timer on the helicopter, because I'm watching this and it just explodes out of nowhere. And I'm like, did I miss something? This whole time I'm thinking like somebody messed up somewhere and they kept it in there. But knowing that it's a perfectly timed explosion, to an extent, makes a lot more sense. So I'm glad it wasn't just out of nowhere, although I wouldn't put it past the film at this point. I think it's a really neat explosion. I think it's one that we haven't, or at least I haven't seen yet in all the times that you've had me on the episode. So I appreciate the uniqueness of this. It kind of just explodes. The debris falls and we keep going. It doesn't linger. It doesn't hang on. I think the explosion is all of a second that we see, and then we just immediately see the debris falling down. And I think the debris falling, we don't really see the debris falling down like that and people interacting with it, or the characters or the set piece, anything like that. So to see something like that crash down and affect the people around it, which typically would happen, but it's not focused on in other films, is kind of nice.
Yeah, I would agree with you. That aspect of the wreckage of the exploding helicopter crashing down, and then that wreckage falling, becoming part of the kind of the other action that is taking place is actually quite unusual. There are only really a few examples that I can think of off the top of my head where that is, where that sort of thing happens. There is a film that I mentioned on a recent podcast called Countdown in Esmeralda's Bay, where George Kennedy, the great George Kennedy, is in that film, and he shoots at a helicopter that is attacking him. He takes out the helicopter with his rifle. The helicopter explodes, and then the wreckage crashes down onto him and immediately kills George Kennedy. And that's it's kind of an unintentionally hilarious sequence, but it's an example of the kind of that sort of the wreckage then actually then playing kind of like having an ongoing part in the story of the film. And it is kind of unusual, but I would also pick up on some of the other things that you've mentioned here. It's a very quick, it's a very brief exploding helicopter that we see here, and it is kind of, as a consequence, is kind of underwhelming, even with the fact that the wreckage then plays this part with like knocking out the other pursuing henchmen. And I think that really highlights one other aspect of this sort of exploding helicopter, which is it's such an incredible coincidence that the helicopter explodes at exactly the right moment in order to knock out those horse-backed henchmen. It does, in a film that is stretching credibility and credulity quite as much as Firepower already is, to have that as part of the kind of your big action finale, it's you're asking the audience to go along with a lot, especially at that moment.
It's almost like when it happens, you're like, yeah, why not? Sure, of course. At this point, fine.
Whatever.
It just keeps
At this
going.
point,
Yeah.
whatever.
Just when will this end?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already made this point, but this film, why is it an hour and 44 minutes? Why?
Yeah, it drags, and then when it starts to pick up again, you're just excited, not because there's action, but because like, oh, it's almost over. Oh, good.
Okay, I think that just about wraps things up for this show. Nick, thanks for joining me once again. Do you want to take a minute to tell people where they can find you online?
Yeah, real quick, did a recent episode of Movie, Films, and Flicks with Mark Hoffmeyer. We talked about the film Annihilation and had a great time. And then recently I was invited on to the inaugural episode of Con Air the Podcast with Mark Hoffmeyer and Jay Cluett as the hosts. They're doing a chapter-by-chapter review, look back, just overall exploration of the film Con Air, and had a really good time doing that as well.
Thanks, Nick. As always, don't forget to check out the Exploding Helicopter website for more reviews of films where helicopters explode. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Letterboxd, or Instagram. If you can rate, review, or retweet us, we'd be very grateful. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep watching the skies for those exploding helicopters.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Ebony magazine. What the distinguished young man is wearing.
Uh-huh. Just like a waiter from an Alabama chicken restaurant.
In a ruffled shirt? I look delicious.